Granular synthesis is a sound synthesis method that operates on the microsound timescale. It is based on the same principle as sampling. However, the samples are not played back conventionally, but are instead split into smaller pieces or samples of sound, usually between 1 and 50 milliseconds or so. These small samples of sound are called grains. Multiple grains may be layered on top of each other and may be played at different speeds, phases, volume, and frequency, among other parameters. At low speeds of playback, the result is a kind of soundscape, often described as a cloud. That is, manipulable in a manner unlike that for natural sound sampling or other synthesis techniques. At higher speeds, the result is heard as a note or notes of a unique timbre. By varying the waveform, envelope, duration, spatial position, and density of the grains, many different sounds can be produced. One of the unique things about granular synthesis is that we're actually able to control our samples with independent control over pitch or frequency and the duration of the sound. So before digital technology, for instance, if we were working with a reel-to-reel tape, if we wanted to alter the pitch of a tone, we had to adjust the playback. And so if we wanted to drop our pitch an octave, we would play the audio file twice as slow. And so playing anything 2 times slower drops the pitch by 1 octave. So you can adjust the pitch in terms of a ratio of playback. Here's a picture of a sound in time. And we can see that there's lots of different waveforms here. And so the basic concept in granular synthesis is that we're going to chop up the sound into lots of tiny little grains and then re-synthesize. Here is another visual image of sound. So in granular synthesis, what we can do is we can chop up this sound into small grains. So this kind of pink line here is, if this is milliseconds listed on the bottom, would be about a 5 millisecond grain of sound. So if I just chop the grain like this into grains, what I can do is then I can reorder the grains, apply different envelopes to each grains, etc. Where things get really interesting is when we actually overlap the grains. Changing the size of the grain can also help determine what the sound will sound like. So on the right-hand side, we have a 10 millisecond grain, whereas on the left-hand side, these bands show a 5 millisecond grain. And where things can get really interesting is if we actually vary or randomize the size of grains over time to add a degree of organicism. One of the important parameters we can control in granular synthesis is the envelope. So if I am applying an envelope like this to each of these sounds, it'll affect how it's played back in terms of each grain. Versus then maybe something that looks like this. Or something that looks like this. So the envelope can really affect how the grains interact. Many DAWs now, including Ableton Live, but also Pro Tools and Logic, have some kind of warping feature of audio. And this is a type of granular synthesis. So in Ableton Live, I've loaded a audio file here, and I'm going to turn warping off and just play this sound file.
Choose double bass.
So if I turn warping on, there's some different warping features here where I can set the type of warping to beats, tones, textures, repitch, complex, and complex pro. You can read about how each of these parameters affects the sound over time. The other thing that whenever I load any kind of sound file into Ableton, it'll create these sort of transient points. So you can see these little triangles here. And what I can do is if I click on them or double click, I can actually now, once I've created a sort of point, I can then adjust and time stretch the audio. So So what I can do here now is I'm just going to play this again. I'm going to set my settings to Complex Pro and play this. This is the normal file.
Choose double bass.
And now I'm going to grab this beginning part, this big. I'm just going to stretch this out. Let's see how far I can go.
B. B.
So you can see what's happening is there's an algorithm where Ableton Live is chopping this sound file into lots and lots of different grains. And in fact, you can kind of see here's the envelope size and then the number of formats. And adjusting these parameters will affect the kind of synthesis, granular synthesis we're doing. So let me reduce the envelope size here and see what that does.
B.
And now I'll make the envelope larger.
B.
So I'm not hearing a huge difference. I'll lower the number of formats.
B.
And now increase it.
B.
So it's a very subtle difference. So depending on what you're time stretching or adjusting using this algorithm, you'll get different kinds of effects of the sound. Here's a basic granular synthesis patch made in Max for Live and then loaded into Ableton Live. And so in many granular synthesis patches and plugins, we have control over things like grain size, maybe adjusting the frequency or pitch or panning, and then sometimes the location where in the sound file we are applying our granular synthesis. So I've loaded an audio file into this. I'm going to set my grain size to 10 milliseconds. And my playback is set to 1, which means normal speed. And I'm not going to do any pitch change. Here's what that would sound like.
Choose double bass.
And so I can get a lot of interesting effects simply even by changing the grain size. Let me make the grain size 50.
Choose double bass.
And now change it to 5.
Choose double bass.
Let me change the speed back to 0.5 or half speed.
Choose double bass.
And now change the grain size.
Choose double bass.
Let me make it a quarter speed.
Choose double bass.
I can also scrub through the sound file.
Choose double bass.
I just have a chord loaded into this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a small region of this and adjust parameters like panning and grain size and the duration of the actual grains as well. This is the time between the grains, and this is actually the grain size over here. So I will select part of this now. So there's very tiny, small grains. And much larger grains. But if I add some reverb to this, it'll really add some depth to the sound. Here's just a simple audio file. It's a bowed tam-tam, or actually it's a bowed water gong. So that's already a pretty complex sound, but when I pop that into our granular synthesizer, so I'll just play it at like 0.25 speed and just from the beginning. And so we'll keep the grains fairly far apart here, and I'm going to adjust the grain duration from about 200 to 300 or so milliseconds. And I've got sort of random panding a little bit right and left, and it's going to kind of alternate between that. I'm just going to keep the pitch shift. I'm not going to pitch shift anything here. So here's what this will sound like. So it's pretty cool. Another thing that I can do is I can also just grab any region of it here and then just start to turn the grains. And what I'll do is I'll adjust the time between the grains in milliseconds, and I'll also adjust the duration, and you'll hear different kinds of effects and things happening there. So you can hear lots of different kind of really cool cloudy effects we can do with this. In this particular patch, if I want to just record this into an audio file then and capture it, I've created the second audio track here. All I have to do is record, enable it. And now what I'll be doing is the input is from this first track, Granular. So that's this track here. And so I can just hit record here and capture anything I do with this as an audio file, and I can use it later in a sampler or however I want to use it. And so here is now my audio file, which I can edit and use however I want to. So the last thing I can do is I can also pitch shift and transpose the grains. So here are the grains, just I've selected a small region here of the file, and if I just start playing this, so now I can click and transpose on this keyboard. So we get some pretty cool effects that way. And then the other thing I can do is over here is where I can actually make chords and things like that. So there's some presets here. So this first preset is just no pitch shift, and then you'll see if I hit some of these, it'll adjust. So there's a few parameters here. So what I'm doing is I'm adjusting by half steps. So it's just transposing each grain by a number of half steps. So in this case, I have no transposition. I'm transposing everything down an octave -12, and then also down -6, which is the tritone. So it gives a kind of a cool tritone octave kind of thing. I could also adjust these numbers manually, so I could do like a whole tone thing. So just halves or just all whole steps. That's pretty cool. I could try to do a major chord. So 0, I'll do a bunch of 4s and then a bunch of 7s. So again, these are half steps, right? So 4 being a major third, 7 being a perfect fifth. The last thing I was just doing there is I can actually use the scrub to kind of scrub through and play it. This is kind of cool in live performance and things like that. So if I want to kind of just manually scrub through the sound file and have granular synthesis occurring at that level. So lots of cool, amazing things we can do with granular synthesis.